Rich rancher kicked grandfather out for being trouble. Days later, 200 natives came to honor him. 200 horses appeared on the horizon like thunder rolling across the valley. Sterling Rhodes lowered his morning coffee, watching the dust cloud grow larger, closer, impossible to ignore. No one traveled in groups that size anymore. Not in these parts. Not for any reason he could understand. The riders wore traditional paint and feathers, but their faces held something Sterling had never seen before, a mixture of reverence and urgency that made his chest tighten. They moved with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going, as if they had been planning this journey for years. Sterling stepped onto his porch, expecting them to pass by his ranch like every other traveler. After all, what business could 200 natives possibly have with him? He was just a cattleman trying to run his land in peace. But the lead rider raised his hand, and the entire group slowed to a stop directly in front of Sterling's house. The silence that followed was heavier than the dust still settling around their horses. The chief dismounted and walked forward, his eyes scanning the porch, the windows, the yard, searching for something, or someone. When his gaze finally settled on Sterling, the disappointment was unmistakable. "Where is the old one?" the chief asked, his voice carrying a weight that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Where is the man who saved us?" Sterling's blood turned cold. 3 days ago, he had forced his grandfather to leave this ranch, calling him a burden, a problem that needed solving. He had watched the old man gather his few belongings and disappear down the same road these riders had just traveled. Now 200 warriors sat on horseback, asking for the man Sterling had thrown away like garbage. The man he had convinced himself was worthless. But what they said next changed everything Sterling thought he knew about his own family. Sterling's throat felt like sandpaper as he stared at the 200 mounted warriors waiting in complete silence. The chief's question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "Where is the old one? The man who saved us?" 3 days ago, Sterling had convinced himself he was solving a problem by forcing his grandfather off the ranch. Now that same decision felt like the biggest mistake of his life. The chief stepped closer, his weathered face showing patience but also determination. Behind him, the other riders remained perfectly still, their horses snorting softly in the morning heat. Sterling had never seen such discipline, such unified purpose. These weren't raiders or troublemakers. They were here for something specific, something important enough to bring 200 people across dangerous territory. Sterling cleared his throat and tried to find his voice. The words came out weaker than he intended, betraying the growing panic in his chest. He explained that his grandfather had left 3 days ago, heading toward the settlements to the east. What he didn't explain was why. How could he tell these men that he had thrown out the very person they were seeking? How could he admit that he had called his own grandfather worthless, a burden, dead weight, that was dragging down the ranch? The chief's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or something deeper that Sterling couldn't identify. The old man asked where exactly his grandfather had gone, what direction he had taken, whether he was traveling alone. Each question felt like a judgment, a reminder of how little Sterling actually cared about the old man's welfare when he forced him to leave. Behind the chief, an older warrior leaned forward on his horse and spoke in their native language. Sterling caught only fragments, but the tone was urgent, almost desperate. The chief nodded grimly and turned back to Sterling with increased intensity. Time, he explained, was running short. They needed to find the old one quickly, before it was too late. Before what was too late? Sterling wanted to ask, but the words stuck in his throat. The chief reached into a leather pouch hanging from his belt and pulled out something that made Sterling's knees nearly buckle. It was a silver pocket watch, tarnished with age but unmistakably familiar. Sterling had seen his grandfather holding that same watch countless times, staring at it with an expression Sterling had always dismissed as senile nostalgia. He had never bothered to ask about its significance. The chief held up the watch so Sterling could see it clearly. The inscription on the back caught the sunlight, revealing words that Sterling had never noticed before. The chief's voice was steady but filled with emotion as he spoke. "This watch," he said, "belonged to the bravest man his people had ever known. The man who risked everything to save their children when no one else would help." Sterling felt the blood drain from his face as the pieces began falling into place. His grandfather, the man he had dismissed as a useless old fool, was apparently some kind of hero to these people. But what had he done? When had this happened? And why had the old man never said a single word about it? The chief tucked the watch back into his pouch and mounted his horse with fluid grace. They would find the old one themselves, he announced. But Sterling heard something else in his voice now, something that made his stomach twist with dread. The chief was disappointed in him, disgusted even. Sterling had failed some test he didn't even know he was taking. As the riders began to move, Sterling realized he had no idea what his grandfather had done for these people. But whatever it was significant enough to bring 200 warriors across hostile territory, and he had thrown that man away like garbage. Sterling stood frozen on his porch, watching the dust cloud disappear toward the eastern hills. His hands shook as he tried to process what had just happened. 200 warriors had traveled across dangerous territory looking for his grandfather, carrying a watch they claimed belonged to the bravest man their people had ever known. The same grandfather Sterling had kicked out 3 days ago for being nothing but trouble. Clara Bell emerged from the house, her face pale with concern. She had watched the entire encounter from the window, and now her eyes held an accusation that cut deeper than any words. She had always been fond of the old man, always insisted he deserved better treatment. Sterling had dismissed her protests as female sentimentality, but now her judgment felt like a crushing weight on his chest. Sterling pushed past his wife and headed straight for his grandfather's old room. The space felt hollow and abandoned, stripped bare of the few possessions the old man had taken with him. But Sterling wasn't looking for what was gone. He was searching for what might have been left behind. Some clue that could explain why 200 people would risk their lives to find one elderly man. In the corner where his grandfather's bed had stood, Sterling noticed something he had never paid attention to before. Scratches in the wooden floor, deep gouges that looked like they had been made by something heavy being dragged repeatedly across the same spot. Sterling knelt down and ran his fingers along the marks, trying to understand their purpose. What had his grandfather been hiding under that bed? Clara Bell appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her voice was quiet, but filled with barely contained anger, as she reminded Sterling of all the times his grandfather had tried to tell stories about his younger days. Stories Sterling had cut short with impatient sighs and dismissive comments. Stories about adventures and dangers that Sterling had assumed were the confused ramblings of an old mind. Sterling felt sick as he remembered the countless occasions when his grandfather had attempted to share memories, only to be silenced by Sterling's indifference. The old man had eventually stopped trying, retreating into a silence that Sterling had mistaken for senility. But what if those stories had been real? What if his grandfather had been trying to prepare him for something like this? Moving to the small wooden dresser his grandfather had used, Sterling began searching through the empty drawers more carefully. Most contained nothing but dust and the faint smell of the old man's tobacco. But in the bottom drawer, his fingers found something the old man had apparently forgotten to take. A small piece of leather, worn smooth by years of handling, with strange markings carved into its surface. Sterling held the leather fragment up to the light streaming through the window. The markings weren't random scratches. They formed a deliberate pattern, almost like a map or some kind of message. But Sterling couldn't make sense of the symbols, couldn't understand what his grandfather had been trying to preserve or remember. Clara Bell stepped closer, her anger momentarily replaced by curiosity. She examined the leather piece, tracing the carved lines with her finger. The markings reminded her of something, she said slowly. Something she had seen before but couldn't quite place. The symbols looked familiar, like they belonged to a language or system she had encountered somewhere in her past. Sterling's mind raced with new questions. If this leather fragment was important enough for his grandfather to keep hidden, what else had the old man been concealing? How many secrets had Sterling missed because he was too arrogant to listen? And more importantly, what did those 200 warriors know about his grandfather that Sterling had never bothered to learn? Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made both Sterling and Clara Bell freeze. Someone was coming back. Sterling moved to the window and felt his heart sink as he recognized the lone rider approaching the house. It was one of the younger warriors from the group, riding hard and looking desperate. Something had gone wrong. The young warrior slid off his horse before the animal had completely stopped, his face etched with urgency and fear. Sterling rushed out to meet him, Clara Bell close behind, both sensing that whatever news this man carried would change everything. The warrior's English was broken but clear enough to understand. The old one was in trouble. Bad trouble. Sterling's chest tightened as the warrior explained what they had found. His grandfather had made it only halfway to the settlements before collapsing on the trail. He was alive but weak, suffering from exhaustion and something else the warrior couldn't explain. The other members of the group had stayed with him, trying to keep him comfortable, but they feared time was running out. The old man kept asking for his grandson, kept saying there were things Sterling needed to know before it was too late. The warrior reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn from repeated handling. His grandfather had insisted this be brought to Sterling immediately. The warrior's hands trembled slightly as he passed it over, and Sterling noticed something in the young man's eyes that looked like reverence, almost like he was handling something sacred. Sterling unfolded the paper with shaking fingers, revealing his grandfather's familiar handwriting. The words were faded, but still legible, written in the careful script the old man had always used. It was a letter addressed to Sterling, dated only 3 months ago. His grandfather had apparently been preparing for this moment, knowing that someday the truth would have to come out. The letter began with an apology that hit Sterling like a physical blow. His grandfather wrote about keeping secrets, about carrying burdens that weren't meant for one man alone. He explained that 30 years ago, he had made a promise to protect a group of children, native children whose parents had been killed by raiders. Sterling's hands began to shake as he read about how his grandfather had risked his own life to guide these children to safety, crossing hostile territory for weeks while being hunted by the same men who had killed their families. Clara Bell read over Sterling's shoulder, her hand covering her mouth as the full scope of his grandfather's heroism became clear. The old man had saved 19 children, delivering them safely to their relatives in the Northern Territories. He had been wounded in the process, shot twice while defending the children from pursuing raiders. The tribal leaders had given him the pocket watch as a symbol of their eternal gratitude, along with a promise that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. Sterling felt physically ill as he continued reading. His grandfather wrote about how he had tried many times to tell Sterling these stories, to explain why the watch was so important, why certain memories still woke him up at night. But Sterling had always been too busy, too impatient, too convinced that the old man's stories were worthless ramblings. The letter revealed that his grandfather had been carrying guilt for 30 years, wondering if he had done enough, if those children had grown up to live good lives. The warrior watched Sterling's face as he absorbed this information, then spoke again with quiet intensity. Those 19 children had indeed grown up. They had become leaders, warriors, mothers and fathers. Some of them were among the 200 who had come looking for the old one. They had traveled for weeks to bring him news that would finally ease his guilt, to tell him that the children he saved had not only survived, but thrived. Sterling looked up from the letter, his vision blurred with tears he couldn't control. The warrior continued speaking, explaining that they had planned to honor his grandfather with a ceremony, to formally thank him in front of all their people. But now they feared they might be too late. The old man's body was failing, and he seemed to be losing the will to fight. Sterling crumpled the letter against his chest and looked toward the eastern hills where his grandfather lay dying. The man he had thrown away like garbage was a hero who had saved children. The stories he had dismissed as senile rambling were accounts of genuine courage and sacrifice. And now Sterling might never get the chance to apologize, to tell his grandfather that he finally understood. The warrior mounted his horse and waited for Sterling's decision. They needed to leave immediately if there was any hope of reaching the old man while he was still conscious. Sterling looked at Clara Bell, seeing his own regret reflected in her eyes, then grabbed his horse's reins. Sterling pushed his horse harder than he ever had before, following the young warrior across terrain that became increasingly rough and unforgiving. Every minute that passed felt like a nail being driven into his conscience. His grandfather could be dying right now, and Sterling would have to live with the knowledge that he had wasted years dismissing a genuine hero as a worthless burden. The warrior led them through narrow passes between rocky hills, following trails that Sterling never would have found on his own. As they rode, the young man shared more details about that rescue 30 years ago. His own father had been one of the saved children, just 7 years old when Sterling's grandfather had found him hiding in the ruins of his burned village. The warrior's voice carried deep emotion as he described how the old man had carried the smallest children when they couldn't walk anymore, how he had shared his own food when the children were starving. Sterling felt each revelation like a physical blow. His grandfather had literally carried children to safety, sacrificing his own comfort and safety for people he barely knew. Meanwhile, Sterling couldn't even tolerate having the old man at his dinner table. The contrast between his grandfather's selfless courage and his own petty cruelty was almost unbearable. They reached a small grove of trees where Sterling could see horses clustered together and people moving around a makeshift camp. As they approached, the other warriors looked up with expressions of hope mixed with concern. The chief who had spoken to Sterling earlier stepped forward, his face grim but determined. Sterling's grandfather was conscious but barely responsive, fading in and out of awareness like a candle flame in the wind. Sterling dismounted and followed the chief to where his grandfather lay on a blanket spread beneath the largest tree. The old man looked smaller than Sterling remembered, his skin pale and his breathing shallow. But when Sterling knelt beside him, his grandfather's eyes focused and a weak smile crossed his weathered face. Sterling felt his throat close up as he realized this might be the last conversation they would ever have. His grandfather's voice was barely above a whisper, but his words were clear and deliberate. He apologized for leaving without explaining everything, for keeping secrets that Sterling deserved to know. He spoke about the leather fragment Sterling had found, explaining that it was a map showing the location where he had buried the personal belongings of the children's parents. Items too precious to leave behind, but too dangerous to carry during their escape. Sterling took his grandfather's hand, feeling how cold and fragile it had become. He tried to find words to express his regret, his shame at the way he had treated the old man. But his grandfather stopped him with a gentle squeeze, saying that understanding was more important than apologies. The old man's eyes grew distant as he spoke about the burden of carrying those memories alone, about wondering for 30 years whether he had done enough to honor the parents who had died. The chief approached and knelt on the other side of Sterling's grandfather, speaking in a voice filled with reverence and gratitude. He explained that they had come not just to thank the old man, but to share news that would finally give him peace. The children he had saved had not only survived but had become the foundation of their community's renewal. Teachers, leaders, healers, warriors who had passed down stories of the brave white man who had risked everything for them. Sterling watched his grandfather's face transform as the chief continued speaking. Tears streamed down the old man's cheeks as he learned that his sacrifice had created a legacy far greater than he had ever imagined. The children had grown up to have children of their own, and every one of them knew the story of their rescue. Sterling's grandfather hadn't just saved 19 lives, he had preserved an entire future. But even as joy filled his grandfather's eyes, Sterling could see the old man's strength continuing to fade. The journey and the emotional weight of finally sharing his story were taking their toll. The chief noticed it too, and spoke urgently to the other warriors in their native language. They needed to perform the honoring ceremony immediately, while the old man was still conscious to receive it. Sterling helped lift his grandfather to a sitting position as the warriors began forming a circle around them. But as they prepared to begin their tribute, his grandfather grabbed Sterling's arm with surprising strength and pulled him close. There was something else, the old man whispered urgently. Something about the buried belongings that Sterling needed to understand. Something that would change how he saw their family forever. Sterling leaned closer as his grandfather's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. The old man's eyes were focused and determined despite his weakening condition. He spoke about the buried belongings, explaining that among the personal items he had saved from the burned village was something that belonged to Sterling's own family. Something that proved their family's connection to these people went back much further than anyone had realized. Sterling's grandfather revealed that Sterling's grandmother, the woman who had died when Sterling was just a boy, had not been the simple farm woman everyone believed her to be. She had been born to a native family, adopted by white settlers as an infant, during a raid that scattered her original people. The leather fragment Sterling had found was actually a piece of her childhood clothing, marked with symbols that identified her original tribe. The revelation hit Sterling like a physical blow. His grandmother, whose gentle face he could barely remember, had been native, which meant Sterling himself carried that blood, that heritage he had never known existed. The chief overheard the conversation and turned toward them with an expression of profound recognition. Sterling's grandmother had been the daughter of one of their most respected leaders, a child they had mourned as lost forever. Sterling's grandfather continued speaking with increasing urgency, explaining that Sterling's grandmother had spent her entire adult life wondering about her origins, asking questions that no one could answer. She had died never knowing the truth about where she came from, never understanding why she felt such a deep connection to the land and the old ways. The old man had discovered her true identity only after her death, when he rescued the children and learned about the family symbols they carried. The chief stood and spoke to the gathered warriors in their native language, his voice filled with emotion. Several of the older men stepped forward, examining Sterling's face with new interest. They could see it now, the chief explained, the resemblance to the family they had lost so many years ago. Sterling's bone structure, the way he held his head. Even his eyes carried traces of their bloodline. Sterling felt the ground shifting beneath him as he tried to process this information. Everything he thought he knew about his family, his identity, his place in this land was being rewritten in a matter of minutes. He wasn't just a rancher who happened to own property in this territory. He was connected to this place by blood, by heritage, by ties that went back generations. His grandfather reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. Inside was a silver bracelet, tarnished with age but still bearing intricate engravings that matched the symbols on the leather fragment. This had belonged to Sterling's grandmother as a child, saved from the ruins of her original home and carried by her adoptive parents until they passed it down to her husband. Sterling took the bracelet with shaking hands, feeling the weight of history in the small piece of silver. His grandfather explained that he had planned to give this to Sterling years ago, along with the full story of his heritage. But Sterling had always been so dismissive of family history, so impatient with anything that didn't relate to immediate profits and practical concerns. The old man had finally decided to take the secret to his grave rather than face another rejection. The chief stepped closer and examined the bracelet carefully. His face transformed with recognition and something approaching awe. This bracelet had belonged to the daughter of their greatest peacemaker, a leader who had tried to bridge the gap between native peoples and white settlers. Sterling's grandmother had been the child of a man who believed both peoples could share the land in harmony. Sterling looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing them with completely different eyes. These weren't strangers who had come to honor his grandfather. They were distant relatives, members of his own extended family tree. The connection went both ways, he realized. His grandfather had saved their children, but they were also his people, his grandmother's people, his own blood. But even as this revelation transformed Sterling's understanding of himself, he could see his grandfather growing weaker. The effort of sharing these long-held secrets was draining the last of the old man's strength. The chief noticed it too, and spoke urgently to the other warriors. If they were going to perform the honoring ceremony, it had to happen immediately. Sterling helped support his grandfather as the warriors began arranging themselves in a formal circle. But as they prepared to begin, his grandfather gripped Sterling's hand one more time and whispered something that made Sterling's blood run cold. Sterling's grandfather whispered that the men who had killed the children's parents 30 years ago were still alive, still operating in the territory, still hunting for the location of the buried belongings because they believed treasure was hidden with the family items. The old man's voice was urgent and fearful as he explained that these raiders had never stopped looking for the children they had failed to capture, convinced that the families had buried gold and valuable items before the attack. Sterling felt ice form in his veins as his grandfather continued. The raiders knew about the rescue, knew that someone had helped the children escape, and they had been searching for that person ever since. Sterling's grandfather had lived in constant fear for 30 years, always watching the horizon, always ready to run if the wrong men came looking for him. And now, by gathering 200 warriors in one place to honor him, they might have attracted exactly the attention they had all been trying to avoid. The chief overheard enough of the conversation to understand the danger, and immediately began issuing quiet orders to his warriors. Several of them mounted their horses and rode out in different directions, taking positions as lookouts on the surrounding hills. The ceremony would continue, the chief declared, but they would be ready for trouble if it came. They had traveled too far and waited too long to let fear stop them from honoring the man who had saved their people. Sterling looked around at the faces surrounding him and felt a profound shift in his understanding of courage. These people were risking their own safety to honor his grandfather, just as the old man had once risked everything to save their children. The cycle of sacrifice and loyalty was continuing across generations, and Sterling was witnessing something far more powerful than he had ever imagined possible. The warriors formed a perfect circle around Sterling and his grandfather, their presence both protective and ceremonial. The chief began speaking in their native language, his voice carrying across the grove with dignity and reverence. Though Sterling couldn't understand the words, he could feel the weight of gratitude and respect flowing through the ceremony. These people were using their own language to tell the story of his grandfather's heroism, preserving it in the oral tradition that would carry it forward to future generations. One by one, the warriors approached Sterling's grandfather and placed small objects at his feet: carved wooden tokens, polished stones, strips of leather marked with symbols, feathers bound with colored thread. Each item represented something meaningful, gifts that honored not just what the old man had done, but who he was as a person. Sterling watched his grandfather's face as each warrior knelt before him and saw tears streaming down the old man's cheeks. The chief explained that these gifts would be buried with Sterling's grandfather when his time came, ensuring that he would be remembered properly in the spirit world. But the old man shook his head weakly and pointed toward Sterling. He wanted these tokens to stay with his grandson, to remind Sterling of his heritage and the responsibilities that came with it. The connection between their families was not something that would end with one generation. Sterling accepted each gift as it was placed in his hands, feeling the weight of tradition and expectation settling on his shoulders. These people weren't just honoring his grandfather. They were welcoming Sterling into a larger family, a broader understanding of what it meant to belong to this land. The leather fragment and silver bracelet were no longer just mysterious objects from his grandmother's past. They were symbols of his own identity, proof that he belonged here in ways he had never understood. As the ceremony continued, Sterling found himself thinking about all the opportunities he had missed to understand his grandfather's stories. How many times had the old man tried to share this history, only to be shut down by Sterling's impatience and dismissiveness? How many chances had Sterling wasted to learn about his own heritage, his own connection to this place and these people? But even as Sterling grappled with his regret, he noticed his grandfather's breathing becoming more labored. The effort of staying conscious for the ceremony was taking everything the old man had left. The chief noticed it too and began speaking more quickly, rushing to complete the ritual before it was too late. Then one of the lookout riders came galloping back into the grove, his horse lathered with sweat and his face tight with alarm. He spoke rapidly to the chief in their native language, pointing toward the southern hills. Sterling couldn't understand the words, but the effect on the warriors was immediate and unmistakable. The raiders his grandfather had feared for 30 years were coming. The chief immediately took command, issuing sharp orders that sent warriors scattering to defensive positions throughout the grove. Sterling found himself torn between staying with his dying grandfather and grabbing a weapon to help defend against the approaching threat. The scout reported at least 20 armed riders moving toward their location, following tracks that would lead them directly to the ceremony. Sterling's grandfather struggled to sit up despite his weakness, his eyes suddenly alert with the kind of fear that comes from 30 years of looking over one's shoulder. He gripped Sterling's arm with surprising strength and spoke urgently about the buried belongings. The location had to remain secret no matter what happened. Those raiders had killed entire families searching for treasure that didn't exist, and they would kill again if they thought they were close to finding it. The chief assigned 4 warriors to guard Sterling and his grandfather while the others prepared for battle. Sterling protested that he could fight, that this was his responsibility too, but the chief's response made it clear that Sterling's safety was now their priority. He was family, blood of their blood, and they would protect him just as they would protect their own children. The irony wasn't lost on Sterling, that these people were now defending him with the same fierce loyalty his grandfather had once shown their ancestors. As the sound of approaching horses grew louder, Sterling made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He stood up despite the chief's protests and announced that he would face the raiders alone. This was his land, his grandfather, his responsibility. If the raiders wanted information about buried treasure, they could get it from him directly instead of attacking people who were simply trying to honor a dying man. Sterling's grandfather tried to object, but his strength was too far gone to be effective. The chief argued that Sterling didn't understand how dangerous these men were, that they had spent decades killing anyone who might have information about the lost children and their families' belongings. But Sterling had made up his mind. He had spent too many years being a coward, too many years dismissing the courage of others. It was time to find out if he had inherited anything besides blood from his grandmother's people. Sterling walked out of the grove and stood in the open area where the raiders would first see him. He could hear them now, rough voices discussing tracks and speculating about the number of horses they were following. When they finally came into view, Sterling felt his mouth go dry. These weren't desperate men driven by poverty. They were professional killers, well-armed and clearly experienced in violence. The leader of the raiders pulled his horse to a stop about 30 feet away and studied Sterling with calculating eyes. He demanded to know where the old man was, the one who had interfered with their business 30 years ago. Sterling's heart pounded as he realized these men had been hunting his grandfather for decades, following rumors and half-remembered stories across hundreds of miles of territory. Sterling told them his grandfather was dead, died on the trail 2 days ago, buried in an unmarked grave that Sterling could show them if they wanted proof. The lie came easier than he expected, and he could see the raiders weren't entirely convinced but were willing to consider the possibility. Their leader dismounted and approached Sterling with casual menace, asking about the buried belongings and what Sterling knew about their location. Sterling maintained that his grandfather had never said anything about buried treasure, that the old man had been sick and confused for years before his death. He could feel sweat running down his back as the raider leader studied his face for signs of deception. Behind the leader, the other raiders spread out in a semicircle, hands resting on their weapons, ready to act on any signal. But as Sterling continued his performance, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the raiders had dismounted and was walking toward the grove, drawn by the sound of voices speaking in the native language. The warrior guards had been trying to keep quiet, but Sterling's grandfather had begun calling out weakly, delirious from fever and unaware of the danger. The raider stopped and called back to his leader, reporting what he had heard. Sterling watched the leader's expression change from suspicious interest to deadly certainty. There were natives hiding in the grove, which meant this was exactly the kind of gathering they had been looking for. The raider leader smiled at Sterling with cold satisfaction and drew his weapon. Sterling realized his deception had failed completely, and now everyone in that grove was about to die because of his grandfather's heroism 30 years ago. Unless Sterling could find a way to turn this situation around in the next few seconds, the ceremony honoring his grandfather would become a massacre. Sterling raised his hands slowly and spoke with more confidence than he felt. He told the raider leader that they were all making a terrible mistake, that this wasn't about treasure or old grudges. This was about legal property ownership and federal marshals who were expecting Sterling back at his ranch by evening. The raiders paused, clearly not expecting this kind of response from what they had assumed would be an easy intimidation. Sterling pressed his advantage, explaining that he owned thousands of acres in this territory through legal government grants, and that attacking landowners brought federal attention that smart outlaws avoided. He pulled out the deed papers he always carried and showed them to the leader, pointing out the official seals and signatures that proved his legal standing. The raiders were killers, but they weren't stupid. They understood that murdering a legitimate landowner was very different from killing random travelers. The raider leader studied the papers with growing unease, realizing that Sterling wasn't just some random settler they could eliminate without consequences. Sterling continued talking, explaining that federal marshals regularly patrolled his property to ensure the safety of legal landowners, and that his failure to return home would trigger an immediate investigation. The other raiders began looking nervous, shifting in their saddles as they understood the implications. Sterling made his final gambit, offering the raiders a deal that would give them what they wanted without the risk of federal retaliation. He would pay them $500 in cash to leave his property immediately and never return. That was more money than they would ever find in any buried belongings, and it came without the danger of fighting 200 warriors or dealing with federal marshals. The raider leader hesitated, clearly tempted by the offer, but unwilling to abandon a 30-year search without something to show for it. Sterling could see the man weighing his options, calculating risks and rewards. Then Sterling played his final card, mentioning that his wife had already sent word to the territorial authorities about the large group of natives on their property, and that those authorities would be arriving soon to investigate. That decided it. The raider leader cursed but ordered his men to mount up. $500 cash was better than a fight they might not win, especially with federal involvement looming. Sterling walked back to his house under armed escort, retrieved the money from his safe, and handed it over to the raiders. They took the cash and rode off toward the southern hills, finally abandoning their 3-decade hunt. Sterling returned to the grove to find his grandfather barely conscious, but still alive. The ceremony had been completed during the confrontation, with the warriors finishing their honoring ritual, even while preparing for battle. Sterling knelt beside his grandfather and took the old man's hand, finally able to speak the words he should have said years ago. He apologized for his blindness, his arrogance, his failure to see the hero he had been living with all along. His grandfather smiled weakly and squeezed Sterling's hand, with what little strength remained. The old man whispered that understanding was all he had ever wanted, that Sterling's presence at the ceremony was worth more than any words of apology. He spoke about the silver bracelet and the leather fragment, making Sterling promise to keep them safe and pass the stories down to his own children someday. Sterling's grandfather died peacefully as the sun set behind the hills, surrounded by the people whose lives he had saved, and the grandson, who finally understood his worth. The warriors performed their burial rituals with deep reverence, creating a grave that would be maintained and honored by their people for generations to come. Sterling participated in the ceremony, accepting his role as the keeper of his grandfather's memory and his grandmother's heritage. The chief presented Sterling with the silver pocket watch, explaining that it now belonged to him as the continuation of his grandfather's legacy. Sterling accepted it with humility, understanding that he was receiving more than just a timepiece. He was accepting responsibility for maintaining the bridge his grandfather had built between two peoples, two ways of life that could coexist in respect and mutual support. Sterling returned to his ranch a different man than the one who had left it. He kept his grandfather's room exactly as it was, turning it into a place where he could study the leather fragment and remember the stories he had been too proud to hear while his grandfather was alive. The silver bracelet sat on his mantle as a reminder of the heritage he carried and the responsibilities that came with it. In the months that followed, Sterling developed relationships with the tribal leaders, sharing resources during difficult seasons and learning about the land from people who had lived on it for generations. He never forgot that his grandfather's courage had made all of this possible, and he worked every day to prove himself worthy of the legacy he had inherited through blindness and nearly lost through arrogance. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.